Hello, folks. Welcome to the Bradley J. Show. We are here once again this week with Rich Rubino, political historian, and we're going to talk about populism. That was Rich's idea, and I'm glad he had that idea. Hi, Rich.
Hi, Bradley. Glad to be here again.
Yeah, great. We're going to talk about what it is, what the types are of it, what brings it, what causes it to rise, what are the dangers, what are the upsides of populism. So we'll give it the basic who, what, when, where, why, like a good journalist. What is populism, Rich?
Yes, and essentially, it's kind of confusing because you hear it on the right wing and you hear it on the left wing. Sometimes you even hear it in the center in the case of Ross Perot. But the one kind of consanguinity here, the commonality is this. Essentially, it's the people versus the powerful. The idea that there are greedy special interests that essentially are snubbing their nose at the common person. Now that can be, for example, for some on the conservative side, those people could be Hollywood elites, academic folks, people that basically are cultural elites, if you will. That's what some people on the right would say. On the left, it's more the moneyed interests, the corporations. In the United States, there's actually a real history of populism. I guess before the term was really used, you could go back to Andrew Jackson. And Andrew Jackson was really the first president who did not come from a patrician background. His predecessors all came from very, very opulent and wealthy backgrounds. So Andrew Jackson comes in there and he calls himself the People's Tribune. And as a result, a lot of the people actually came to what was called the Executive Mansion, now called the White House. Kind of the common people actually came and went right on the White House lawn thinking essentially, he's our person. He comes from us. He's one of us, to the point that Jackson had to kind of sneak in the back. They had, rum punch and everything else. But the term really came prevalent in the United States in around the 1890s. So James Weaver, who's kind of been lost to history, he was a congressman he was a congressman who left the political establishment. First, he was the nominee of the third party called the Greenback Party, which essentially wanted more money in circulation. Then in 1892, and he actually began, and this usually populism often begins when there's an economic crisis. And he began leaving the political establishment during the Panic of 1873 under President Ulysses S. Grant, basically saying that the corporations were hegemonic over everybody. So he started that party. And then in 1892, he was actually the candidate. He started another party called the People's Party, which took on the term populist, the Populist Party. And he won about 8.5% of the vote and actually won 4 states that year as a third-party candidate. I mean, for example, by comparison, the last third-party candidate to actually win a state in the United States was George Wallace back in 1968, and all of his states were in the South. So he ran in 1892. Then in 1896, this often happens, when there's an aperture in American politics, everyone goes to try to fill it. So the two major parties in 1896, the Democrats, as opposed to nominating Grover Cleveland, who was an establishment candidate, someone who supported the gold standard, someone who is seen as very conservative, the party had a revolution and nominated a 36-year-old orator from Nebraska, former two-term congressman, failed candidate for the Senate named William Jennings Bryan. He talked about a cross of gold. He talked about a progressive income tax, more efficient social services. He talked about more funding for education. So consequently, James Weaver essentially abandoned the Populist Party, and his party instead supported William Jennings Bryan, and kind of a lot of that populism came into the William Jennings Bryan platform. So the question is, how is it also on the right? Because you hear a bit on the left and you hear a bit on the right. Well, on the left, it basically was taken over by, for example, Fred Harris ran in 1972 and 1976. He was a former liberal. And when he was a liberal, this is kind of where the cultural part comes in. He said that the liberals was essentially taken over by the Hollywood elites, by academicians, I guess you'd call them. And he basically said, we need a party that's for the working class. And that's exactly what the right does as well. George Wallace ran in 1964, 68, 72, and 76, all essentially talking about the cultural elites. Pat Buchanan ran this way, but they also, on economic issues, and this includes Donald Trump as well. On economic issues, I've never seen a populist that's in America that supports unfettered, unencumbered free trade and capitalism. Pat Buchanan ran for president. He was talking about essentially he had a soft spot for social services. Donald Trump, when he ran for president, as conservative as you might think he was, He did not want to privatize Social Security or privatize entitlements, and talked about how important they were, because he knew where his bread was buttered. He knew his constituency in terms of populists. The Donald Trump constituency, the Pat Buchanan constituency, the George Wallace constituency were not essentially libertarian kind of who worship at the altar of Ayn Rand and essentially want government out of everything. They're generally social conservatives, but fiscally they're kind of moderate. Fiscally they're populist, and they tend to favor social programs. And that's kind of the one commonality that brings these kind of disparate elements between right and left together, I think.
What kind of conditions tend to generate populism?
Yep. Almost always there is some sort of an economic dislocation. Now, sometimes, for example, in the 1890s, the economic dislocation, James Reaver ran in 1892, the country was not marred in a Great Depression. There was a depression next year, the Panic of 1893. So consequently, by 1896, William Jennings Bryan, because of the depression, the Democratic Party kind of said, we're mad as hell. We're not going to take it anymore. We're not going to nominate these conservatives like Grover Cleveland. We're going to nominate a populist. So they nominated someone in the form of William Jennings Bryan. Now, it can also sometimes be social issues, social revolutions. For example, when Lyndon Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act in 1964, there was a populist backlash from some white blue-collar voters. So George Wallace threw his hat in the ring, ran in the Democratic primaries that year, not to win, but more to send a message. He used to say, send them a message in Washington, and did very well in Wisconsin specifically and Maryland with that constituency. He ran again in 1968, and that year, not only did you have the racial issue, but you also had Vietnam, you had racial riots, and George Wallace ran again that year and actually won some southern states and did relatively well for a third-party candidate. Now, Pat Buchanan's time was a little bit different, because when he first ran in 1992, he ran for the Republican presidential nomination, and the country actually, the beginning of Bush administration, the economy was in relatively good shape. You started to see a little bit of a decline and a minor recession, and Pat Buchanan went to New Hampshire and basically ran as a blue-collar candidate. He would go to Berlin, New Hampshire, and you see factories that have essentially shut down. And someone who used to be an unfettered free trader now talked about the deindustrialization, talked about the working man and how the Bush administration was hurting the working man. So he ran basically about the economy. Now, in 1996, the economy had gravely improved, but Pat Buchanan still had an issue, and he actually won the New Hampshire primary, beating Bob Dole, Phil Gramm, Steve Forbes, and Lamar Alexander, and the litany of establishment candidates, Dick Lugar. He talked about the economic dislocation. In other words, he talked about the stagnation in wages, and he talked about his constituents, some of whom were Democrats, independents, and Republicans, who have been left behind in the economic prosperity of the 90s. So the economy was generally good, time and peace and prosperity, but some working voters did not feel it. Now, I'll say one other example, and Ross Perot was kind of anomalous here, because Ross Perot ran in 1992, and he was a populist, but he was a centrist. Deficit reduction is not usually a populist issue. Conservatives like Donald Trump, Mike Huckabee, who run as conservative populists, generally want to spend money. George Wallace, very liberal when it comes to social spending. He used to say, I have no problem with spending money. I want to spend money. He said the Reagan tax structure was was extremely unfair. He was very much against that. He very much wanted, he very much said that the rich were getting richer, the poor were getting poorer. Perot ran in 1992, and his big thing was cutting the deficit by increasing the gas tax. And he did this as a centrist. He kind of said, essentially, this is the people versus the powerful in a sense. In a sense, there's kind of a group of, wealthy individuals who have taken over the country. But he says we need fiscal conservatism. And it actually worked for him in that he garnered 18.9% of the vote that year.
So this is a bit of an aside. You mentioned, there are these sort of sub-parties pop up, the Know Nothing Party, etc. Would the mega hardcore folks in the House now start to represent some sort of sub-party like that, and what would you call it?
I guess you could call it the mega party. The only way I think that happens is if Trump runs for the Republican nomination and loses and decides he still wants to be in the game and says, okay, can you get me the signatures, and we'll run in the general election. He could theoretically, there could be a poll, say December, that shows him losing. the Republican primary, he could essentially say that the Republican this whole game is rigged. It's all the big boys rigging the system. So I'm going to leave the party and I'm going to form a third party. Theodore Roosevelt did that. He actually said, I'm going to throw my hat in the ring, and did that in 1912. Trump does that. The worst possible nightmare for the Republican Party, in that there's a big schism in the party. But if he does that, I do think that there are some members of the MAGA that could potentially, and I don't think this is necessarily realistic, but I can see a scenario where it happens. I can envisage it, where someone like Matt Gaetz or Lori Bobart or Bob Good from Virginia all decide, let's leave the Republican Party and form our own caucus. The problem, if they do that, then they still have to go back to Kevin McCarthy for committee assignments, because it's the part you have to caucus with a party in order to get committee assignments. If you don't caucus with a party, you don't have a committee assignment. So the only way they would do that is to essentially say they're not going to run for re-election and just completely go rogue. But it's kind of an outlandish scenario right now.
The MAGA folks are kind of interesting because they don't seem to have any. Well, I know what they're trying to do: decentralize the power of the speaker, et cetera, et cetera. But it's important to remember that they don't have to govern. All they have to do is do whatever they do for their base at home. Play to the base at home. It doesn't matter if it's sensible or workable or anything else. So when you see these people doing this, to me, they're playing to the base back home. They can be as crazy as they want, and they don't have. It will only help get them reelected.
That's generally true. I think there's some exceptions. Scott Perry, for example, the chairman of the Freedom Caucus in Pennsylvania, around Harrisburg, actually represents somewhat of a bellwether district. It's becoming more and more of a showdown or a swing district. It's becoming a little bit more Democratic. So he does actually have to come home and say, in a sense, I've brought home this largesse. But in terms of somebody like Matt Gaetz, very conservative district, the only way he'd ever lose would be if he loses in a primary or somebody outrights him.
Right.
Now, Lori Bobart, though, interesting. She got elected to Congress by defeating Scott Tippman, who was basically a center-right, somewhat conservative Republican. She ran in the primary, defeated him. This is not a demonstrably Republican district, and we saw this last time around, where she underperformed. This district Donald Trump won by about 8 points. She barely won that district by less than 1,000 votes, in part, I think, because that is not necessarily a populist conservative district. It's more of a traditional structural Republican district, but she got enough votes in what was an underreported primary. So there are some Republicans that I think it could potentially have deleterious effects, but someone like Matt Gaetz, Bob Good, no, they're very safe.
So I was going to ask a question. You sort of answered it. Are the districts, swinging it back to populism, do these extra MAGA folks, super MAGA folks, represent districts that are populist districts? But you sort of answered the question when it came to Bobart and saying, no, not exactly, not always.
And she's kind of the exception. A lot of them are, because there's a traditional view of a Republican. When people think of a Republican, they think of someone who's at a yacht club, who's at a country club, doesn't necessarily focus on social issues, just essentially wants the government off his or her back, wants unencumbered, essentially, wants unencumbered free trade, just wants essentially to be able to live their lives, essentially somewhat libertarian. That's not what conservative kind of is contemporaneously. That's one branch of it. But there's also conservatives that are not opulent, that are not wealthy, do not have lucrative, not necessarily have lucrative contracts, but they're people who essentially are conservatives and they're Republicans because socially they believe the Democratic Party has alienated working people. They think the Democratic Party is no longer the party of the working people, that they're the party of Hollywood elites, they're the party of academics, they're the party of Harvard, and they don't necessarily relate to them. Now, Bill Clinton in 1992 was able to actually win a lot of these people back, the so-called Reagan Democrats. He brought a lot of these blue-collar voters back, folks who had not gone for Mondale in 84, did not go for the caucus in 88 because they saw them as too liberal. In part, Bill Clinton had a different message, an unorthodox message for a Democrat. He says, I'm a new Democrat. And he says, essentially, we're going to end welfare as we know it. We're going to put 100,000 more police officers on the street. And he said, I'm going to fight for the forgotten middle class. And many in the middle class came to think that the Democrats were only people who were only kind of advocates or tribunes or exponents, if you will, of lower economic classes. Bill Clinton comes in, no, we're going to fight for the middle class. And some people like Jesse Jackson at the time were saying, well, what about essentially, what about those living in poverty? And Bill Clinton essentially said, well, everyone's going to rise up. This is the prosperity. We're going to essentially bring everyone up, but you have to bring the middle class up first. And he did that, and he won a lot of those people back. Joe Biden actually was able to win some of those voters back as well, whereas John Kerry, for example, in 2004, really struggled with that. And a lot of that partly is, I think, in the Bill Clinton's case, in Joe Biden's case, they do not come off as condescending. Sometimes Democrats have the problem that they can come off when they're talking about working class voters almost like condescending, like they're talking down to them.
Right.
Al Gore had that problem.
So
now, Republicans too, Mitt Romney, for example.
And Hillary did, right?
She did, but she's an interesting case, because when she got to Arkansas, she's from Illinois, met Bill Clinton at Yale Law School, went down to Arkansas. When Clinton first ran for governor of Arkansas, she kept her name. She kept her maiden name, Hillary Rodham. Bill Clinton's first term as governor, in part because he raised license plate fees, and Hillary Clinton was seen almost as not Southern enough. She would get, Bill Clinton would go to Arkansas football games, we'd be cheering, she'd be sitting there reading a book. And people started to think of her as somebody that was kind of alien. Bill Clinton loses in 1980, comes back in 1982, runs for re-election. She takes his name. She takes the name Hillary Clinton. And then Bill Clinton appoints her in terms of education reform in 1983. There's a special session on education reform. Hillary Clinton leads that, goes all over the state, barnstorms the state, gets ideas, comes back with the idea that there should be mandatory teacher testing. The first state, Arkansas, becomes the first state in the nation to require that. And then all of a sudden, people really start to like Hillary Clinton as a working class supporter. In Arkansas, she becomes very popular. There's even talk in 1990 that Bill Clinton would not run for re-election. He'd run for president, and Hillary Clinton would succeed him, and she's probably more popular than him. Now, fast forward to 2008, the first time she ran for president, she was the working class candidate. Her and John Edwards, in many respects, Barack Obama, his message about kind of post-partisanship, he was appealing to younger voters. He was appealing essentially to college graduates. He was appealing to more upscale voters. Hillary Clinton always appealed to economically downscale voters. She did extremely well with that constituency. That was kind of her, that was her constituency, if you will. She lost that year because there were too many kind of younger voters that voted for Barack Obama, intellectual voters, if you will. Bill Clinton, by the way, the same constituency in 1992 against Paul Tsongas. But in 2016, she lost that constituency. Now, what happened? Well, in the primary, Berne Sanders happened, and Berne Sanders really started to kind of take a lot of that constituency. But in the general election, Donald Trump exploited a couple of things. He exploited this. He tried to make Hillary Clinton out to be kind of an intellectual elitist, and Hillary Clinton, she said that half of Donald Trump's supporters fell into a basket of deplorables.
Exactly.
And when she said a basket of deplorables, that immediately gave Donald Trump an issue. He says, look what she's calling you. And Donald Trump, despite the fact his patrician background, everything else, he's able to come off as somebody who's not condescending and someone who's a blue collar billionaire, if you will. Now, did he take it out of context? He took that speech out of context. Yes. Did Hillary Clinton misspeak? Yes. But in politics, if there's an issue, Donald Trump takes that issue. And there were many blue-collar voters. About 10% of Berne Sanders voters, for example, landed up voting for Donald Trump in that race. And places like Erie County, Pennsylvania, traditionally Clinton country, traditionally Democrat, Obama won it. Hillary Clinton, Donald Trump was able to flip places like that, in part because he was a different type of Republican. He was a populist Republican. The folks in Erie County, Pennsylvania, would look at someone like, Ronald Reagan, George H.W. Bush, Gerald Ford, Richard Nixon, whoever else, and they would say essentially, they're kind of upscale Republicans who just want to give everybody a tax cut. Donald Trump comes in there and says, no, I'm going to bring your jobs back specifically. I'm going to get rid of NAFTA, everything else. So he flipped places like Erie County, Pennsylvania, West Virginia, where Bill Clinton won by 18 points in 1996, running for re-election. That was Donald Trump's best state in 2016 and 2020, behind Wyoming. That was his second best state, respectively. So Donald Trump, running on a populist platform, appealed to different constituencies. Now, on the other side of that, there were a lot of traditional moderate Republicans in, Marietta, Georgia, who always voted Republican. All of a sudden, kind of suburban Republicans, now they're voting Democrats, which is really kind of a trade-off in that respect. The cost-benefit calculation on both sides.
Back to the cause of a cause of populism, and one of them is that there's an economic issue.
Yes.
And there does not seem to be an economic issue to me now, but is it perceived that there is, and that's one of the reasons for it? Or is it, in this case, more a cultural thing, and wokeism, etc., is driving people to populism?
Yeah, that's driving conservative populism. Conservative populism sometimes focuses on social issues like the so-called woke agenda, and that certainly is bringing some people. That is certainly galvanizing the conservative base. Just the fact that people now, it's part of common parlance, if you will. The average person knows what the word woke, has heard the word woke. They know that they think that there is essentially a coterie of cultural liberals that are trying to take over. They say it's the radical left. You hear that from Donald Trump. You hear that from Republicans a lot right now. Sometimes when conservatives, and also there's certain ethno-nationalism as well. An ethno-nationalism. Now, obviously, it's obvious people, when they come to the United States from other countries, want to be in groups that people like them. That's human nature. You want to be, if you come from the Dominican Republic, you want to move to a community where there are other people from the Dominican Republic because those are the people that essentially you're used to. On the Republican side, and I think Republicans try to exploit this, they essentially say that, they essentially try to talk about the United States as being one country, and they say there are all these people that are trying to be hyphenated Americans. They want to be Cuban Americans, they want to be Haitian Americans, they want to be Eritrean Americans, whatever else it is, and they essentially say we're one America. And in that, in some respects, is something that galvanizes a lot of culturally conservative folks to come to the conservative side. And that's something, by the way, in terms of Bill Clinton being able to bring some of those voters back, he was able to co-opt conservative Republican issues. On crime, for example, in 1991, when he was governor, 1992, rather, when he was governor, 3 days before the New Hampshire primary, he went back to Arkansas to go to preside over, to make sure an execution went well of Ricky Ray Rector in Arkansas. That inoculates himself from the Willie Horton charges of Michael Dukakis that he was liberal on crime. He says essentially we need more police officers on the street. And he says, I'm somebody who's taken on my own party on trade. I've taken on my own party on education. So he was able to bring back some of those voters that kind of, I think, saw the Democratic Party becoming this kind of cultural elite vehicle, if you will. But the whole idea that conservatives often bring people to the populist cause on those social issues. But most Republicans or any conservative who's a populist, I've never really seen one that's a populist that's an economic conservative in terms of being an economic libertarian. Usually they're very populist. Watch Tucker Carlson. Tucker Carlson praised Elizabeth Warren's domestic program, praised Andrew Yang, for example, for his idea of there being a wage permit for essentially everybody getting $300 a month or a year for whatnot in government money for the prevailing wage or whatever they call domestic initiatives. So there are populism in that respect. You have to be at least somewhat domestically liberal, and then people will listen to you on those other issues.
So what are the dangers of populism?
I think the dangers of populism is that the common man will essentially view one person as taking on the elites and will gravitate toward that one person, and it becomes a cult of personality. And you see this a lot in American politics. Usually populism is not necessarily a cause, it's often an individual. You saw this, certainly there were many people who in 2016, Berne Sanders was a cause. Hillary Clinton was the establishment. On the Republican side, Donald Trump became a cause celeb. Everything was about Donald Trump as a person. Whereas somebody like Jeb Bush or Marco Rubio, well, they're the establishment. And it becomes this kind of either or, if you will. It's either us or it's them. And us versus them sometimes can be dangerous. Obviously, sometimes you saw on January 6th, that was very much a populist uprising in respect that it was people who essentially viewed themselves on one side versus the other side. So I think potentially maybe there's the good populism. If there's good populism, if you will, that would be someone that would try to bring disparate classes together and try to make it so that everyone essentially rises up together in all different economic and all different social strata. but I think that's probably the biggest danger of it.
So you've started to address my next question. What are the values of populism? To keep, I
Yeah.
suppose it is a check on
Yeah.
bloated government sometimes. What else?
It keeps a check on the establishment, for one thing. It keeps a check on the idea, because there is obviously human nature. There is a predilection, if you will, to a gravitational pull for elites to essentially band together and support certain policies, for lobbyists to come together, for lobbyist politicians, for members of the media to come together and be kind of a cohort, kind of the big boys, the big girls, if you will. They'll essentially say they're essentially become part of almost this kind of, I guess, populists would call it fascist, if you will, but they become this conglomeration. So that's where essentially you need somebody, you need the little guy, you need someone to say, what about essentially, and what about the people is such a cliche, but what about the people who are not necessarily part of this patrician, part of this wealthy, part of this opulent coterie of Americans? And then obviously when that happens, people have to listen to you. Even Ross Perot, even though his issue was the deficit, when he made the deficit an issue in 1992, Bill Clinton in that primary, deficit was not his major issue. He wanted a middle-class tax cut. But the deficit, the average person started calling in saying, we need deficit reduction. Bill Clinton gets in. His major initiative of his first year of administration was the Budget Discretionary Act, which was deficit reduction. It becomes an issue. Another one that I think is interesting would be Jerry Brown. Remember, Jerry Brown gets elected governor of California. He's 34 years old, known as Governor Moonbeam. He was somewhat fiscally conservative. But in 1992, he kind of transmogrified his entire ideology and became a populist. And he said at the time, he was talking about the big money in politics, even though he was somebody whose father had been a two-term governor. He said, I'm only going to take $100 contributions. He had a 1-800 number. And at the end of every debate, he started reading this 1-800 number to call up to give $100. He ended up raising $6 million. And that year, this kind of campaign finance reform, which he had championed in that campaign, that got into the national forefront as an issue, even though it wasn't really Jerry Brown-esque, if you will, something he'd never really championed that much before. But he made that an issue, and he talked about the elites. He talked about all this, and it became, in respect, sometimes when a populist makes an issue, he does it. Then Ross Perot ran with it, and then it becomes an issue in that respect. And certainly trade was another one, but Jerry Brown's another example too.
It seems like the current super mega brand of populism is anti-tax based. And if you just say yes or no, I'll finish the question.
Well,
am I right on that?
I don't think it's only I don't think it's anti-tax based. I think
all right. There is the anti-tax portion of that. They want to cut spending even for defense, etc.
Yes.
The ultra MAGA people. And there's talk of cutting other services. My question is, the populist folks, the folks back in those populist districts, are they not receiving the benefits from government programs? Do they not want the benefits? Or maybe they're not receiving them. Do only people in the liberal North get the benefits?
No.
So are they saying, we don't want your government money, take it back? Well, that's confusing to me.
Yeah, there are some that would probably say that, like Bob Gooder or Justin Amish, who used to represent the 1st District of Grand Rapids, who was elected as kind of a libertarian, won in a primary, and basically said essentially that he's not going to try to take earmarks, anything like that. But so there are kind of two wings of the Republican Party, even in those districts. There's an establishment wing, essentially those who are essentially, I would call the spoilsmen, people that essentially they're conservatives, but essentially their real role when you get to United States Congress is to bring as much money into their district as possible. That's really what they're there for. They're there to work with other people. That's how they view accomplishments. Then there are those, Ron Paul, for example, when he was in Congress, essentially his role is to decrease the size of government, to enervate the size of government, put it so it can go in like a bathtub, as Grover Norquist used to say, and then you could essentially, and then it could essentially be flushed down the bathtub. But it's interesting, and there certainly is an inherent contradiction, because a lot of these districts are certainly not conservative in terms. They're certainly not wealthy districts. But then there's folks like Harold Rogers from Kentucky, the 2nd poorest district of the country. He's a Republican. His district goes 80% for the Republican, one of the most conservative districts in the country. But they take a lot of largesse from the federal government, and Harold Rogers gets a lot of money from the Appropriations Committee, and he brings it home to his district. But I think in terms of taxes, Donald Trump, when he ran, one thing he talked about was tariffs, for example. and tariffs certainly are taxes, but he's somebody who said we need essentially to increase tariffs. You often hear that from populist Republicans that run for president. They would say, oh, we need a tax cut, but it's not their flagship issue. It's more, sometimes it's more social issues. And also, they also tend to have a certain sympathy for unions. They have a sympathy for unions because a lot of their members are not members of, they're not members of the Chicago Board of Trade. They're members of, they're more likely to be members of, the Steelworkers Union, and those folks sometimes have interests that are divergent with traditional kind of libertarian conservatism.
By the way, I'm a big fan of unions. I don't see how you have a middle class without a decent wage, and I don't see how you have a decent wage without a union. In my considerable experience in that area, if you don't work in a lot of cases, you don't work with a union, you don't make a living wage. That's just an aside.
Well, both conservatives and liberal populists, I think that's where they come together, is they're both very much are sympathetic to unions.
All right. Now, I feel like we've dealt with the populism issue, but I'm curious about how the behavior of the super MAGAs may affect the party. And the question is what we see as they get it together in their new house just a blip, or is it just a blip that is pumped up by media and they'll be fine governing, or do they really have a problem?
They do have a problem governing, and the fact that Kevin McCarthy made concessions, the main concession being that only one member can essentially bring up a motion to vacate the chair, meaning essentially that they would have a vote on essentially dislodging a speaker or putting in a new speaker, means that he is very much captive to that wing of the party. Now, it's only 20 Republicans, but you don't have a supermajority. You have 222 members of the Republican Party, so 20 Republicans can really upset the apple cart. And Kevin McCarthy certainly knows this, and there is very little incentive for Kevin McCarthy to work with Joe Biden on anything. Joe, in his own constituency, the biggest problem would have if he starts working with Joe Biden, someone from the right, someone from the mega wing of the party is going to run against him in Bakersfield, which is the most conservative district in the state of California. There are a lot of conservative parts of California, his district specifically. And I think if that were to happen, there would be a lot of national folks who would essentially, One America types that would essentially be funding that opponent, saying Kevin McCarthy is a sellout. He worked with Joe Biden. Plus, if he gives Joe Biden an accomplishment, Joe Biden runs in 2024, he gives Joe Biden something to go on the campaign trail and say, look, I've worked with Republicans. I've worked with Kevin McCarthy. I've worked with Mitch McConnell. So there's really no incentive for him to work with Joe Biden. There is an incentive for him to be confrontational for Joe Biden for his own political interests in the district, and certainly his interest in staying as speaker.
And on the other hand, it seems to me that in a rare case of Democrats not shooting themselves in the foot, they seem very unified. It seems as though the squad and those rookies have realized that you need to actually maintain power before you get what you want. You can't just initially make a big noise about all the little nuances you want. You have to win first, and there are certain sacrifices you have to make. Yeah. And part of that is party unity. It seems though they've matured, and that I'm curious as to how much more strength and power a unified Democratic Party has over someone whose extreme wing is very, very vocal.
In terms of the issues, probably not very much, because there's very little that's actually going to get done. There's going to be a lot of, it's going to be very hard just even to get a budget passed, because you're going to have such, there's just no incentive for Republicans, except for, folks like Brian Kirkpatrick and a few moderates to work on the other side. But the fact that you saw the Democrats in that display voting 100% from Jared Golden on the right to AOC on the left, 211 Democrats, just one vacancy, voting for the Democrat for Speaker. Now, part of that, Hakeem Jeffries is an unknown entity. Nancy Pelosi was very controversial. Mm-hmm. Nancy Pelosi became a pariah in many of these congressional districts, to the point that the Democrats would have to say that, well, I don't know who I'm going to vote for Speaker. No one knows who Hakeem Jeffries is, so the most conservative, the most liberal Democrat can vote for that person, and he's kind of a bridge between he was part of the progressive wing, but he also, when he first ran for Congress, the person who ran against him was further to the left, and there have been some criticism. Some on the left say that he's not really a progressive. So there's always been this issue with him. But the fact that nobody knows who he is right now, or at least few people know who he is, they're certainly discovering who he is, benefits the Democratic Party. And the fact that if you can go into 2024 right now, and if Joe Biden's running, other than Marianne Williamson, I don't see anybody who's very much a minor candidate, a major candidate, taking on Joe Biden. There's very much going to be unity toward the Democratic nominee, not that they necessarily like Joe Biden, because they really do not like the alternative of the Republican. So I think if any sort of a Democrat were to try to get into the race right now, they would get virtually no money. They would, all the benefactors, everyone else would pressure that Democrat to get out of the race. It's not like, for example, in 1980, when Jimmy Carter was running for re-election and the establishment wanted Ted Kennedy, wanted Jerry Brown to get in because they didn't think Jimmy Carter was really one of them. They thought he was a corporatist. They didn't think he was really a Democrat. So this time around, no matter what Joe Biden does, if he moves to the right, if he moves to the left, the Democrats are probably going to be pretty much in lockstep with Joe Biden in the primary.
One final observation about the Republicans. It's just they're so different now than the Reagan Republican.
Oh, yeah.
Reagan was, the big factor for Reagan was the common enemy of the Soviet Union and a strong military. And now the Republican Party is the party that wants to cut military spending. Any comments on that?
Oh, yeah. No, well, so first of all, in terms of, this is where the right meets left. This is where I always say Ralph Nader's bicycle rams right into Pat Buchanan's Mercedes on military spending. And you hear this from both the right and the left. They'll talk about the military industrial complex. Dwight Eisenhower was president. He actually brought this up. He talked about essentially how the more money being spent, for contractors, for the military. John F. Kennedy tried to run to the right, said essentially we need to spend more on the military, and he ended up winning that year. I mean, currently we spend more than all of our NATO allies combined. For example, if you look at how much we actually spend, $800 billion on budgets, the Pentagon generally gets more money than Joe Biden and the administration, the generals sometimes need. Now, Ronald Reagan, what he did in 1976, the first time he ran, because the Republican Party was not necessarily known as the party for spending more money in the military. Eisenhower, for example, was very much known as somebody who was very frugal. Robert Taft used to be Mr. Republican, the Senate Majority Leader from Ohio, ran for president in 1952, very much wanted to cut military spending. At least he wanted a non-interventionist foreign policy. So Reagan comes in, and the Reagan essentially, he makes three major promises. We're going to cut taxes, we're going to balance the federal budget, and we're going to increase military spending to try to essentially take out the Soviet Union. He increased military spending. He did not balance the budget. He did cut taxes the first year, but then in 1982, he signed, when the deficit started to skyrocket, he signed the Tax Equity Act of 1982, which, accounting for inflation at the time, was the biggest tax increase in American history. And then next year, he worked with Joe Biden, believe it or not, and Tip O'Neill and others down to Patrick Moynihan to essentially try to save Social Security. So they increased taxes on that. But he did increase military spending. What actually began in 1980, when Jimmy Carter was president after Russia invaded Afghanistan. Carter asked for a huge increase in military budgets. But essentially, there are two, again, after the Cold War, there are two paths right here. There's the path, Bill Kristol, neoconservative types who say, we need to continue to spend. We're the one hegemonic power. We need to essentially rule the world, and essentially we need to continue spending the way we did when the Soviet Union existed. Then there are folks who used to be hawks. Pat Buchanan again runs in 1992, says, no, the Cold War is now over. We do not need to have these large military expenditures. Now we need to spend that money. We need to spend that money essentially at home. Others like Rand Paul have said that. Trey Gowdy from South Carolina has said that. So there's always been, now here again, the conservative movement, there's libertarians who essentially say, if you're going to cut social spending, if you're going to cut on everything else, why do you leave the military out? Ron Paul ran for that in 2008, 2012. He wanted major cuts in the military. He also wanted major cuts in just about everything else. Then there are populists who essentially say pretty much the same thing. And that's kind of the Pat Buchanan wing. And then there are traditional conservatives like Mitch McConnell and Kevin McCarthy who essentially say, yes, cut social spending, but leave the military alone. And Donald Trump is somebody who is essentially, even though he kind of presents himself as somebody who's kind of anti-war or anti-interventionist, he presided over a huge elephantine increase in the military budget. So he's not a populist when it comes to the military budget. But the real question, I think, after post Donald Trump, is will the Republican Party continue on Donald Trump's trajectory, the status quo now? Now he's the establishment. Or will they go to the status quo ante, the status quo prior to the status quo, where the Republican Party essentially was before Donald Trump became president, when the establishment of the Republican Party was talking about they were all free traders, they all wanted to increase military spending, a lot of them wanted to liberalize legal immigration laws. So there is kind of a disconnect there, and it's going to be interesting to see what trajectory they go on.
Well, I love talking to you. This has been 40 minutes, so obviously there's a lot to talk about. Rich Rubino, a political historian and commentator and writer, political writer. I always want people to know about your books. You have a book right there to hold up, I bet. Come on now.
Oh, yes, absolutely. This beautiful book, The Great American Political Trivia Challenge, Political Trivia on Steroids.
Okay. And it's fun to include Massachusetts towns by name. Maybe we can figure out something next time.
351 of them.
Right. So maybe we can do 10 Massachusetts towns that figured in prominently to Massachusetts political history or something.
Oh, that is interesting.
So we'll work on that for next time.
And here, I'll give you one trivia question about Massachusetts.
Okay.
What are the two states in Massachusetts, the two municipalities in Massachusetts named after states?
Named after a state. Well, there's Florida, Massachusetts.
Yes.
And there's Texas, Massachusetts.
No, Washington.
Washington. What, you were impressed with Florida, right?
I was impressed with Florida. It's very high, one of the highest elevated parts of the state. Yes, and there's a Peru out there too.
The only reason I knew that is because one time I happened to drive through it and was like, wow, there's a Florida. And I was also impressed by the big hill. You got to go up this giant hill to get to it.
Florida,
so that's good.
Whenever people say that Donald Trump won Florida in 2016 and 2020, in 2020, I say no. Actually, I say Joe Biden actually won Florida. And they say what? Yeah, he won Florida, Massachusetts.
I shouldn't have said Texas. Obviously, that's not a municipality.
Well, I mean, there's not a state name. There's not a municipality named after. But if there was, then yeah, I get what you're saying.
So that's it. Let's save some powder. Keep some powder dry for next time.
Will do.
Thank you, Rich Rubino. We'll talk to you in about a week.
I enjoyed it. Thank you so much, Larry Bradley.
We'll be done in a few seconds.